It could involve stitching together of multiple sources. It could involve identifying patterns. It could involve writing new code. It could involve a bunch of stuff. It could be very complex. None of the models stand alone are good enough. And that's because you don't see any of these models marketing themselves as an LLM for analytics. We're going to now talk about why all of the large language models, the popular ones that you hear of, Gemini, OpenAI, Anthropic, and a bunch of other new up and coming ones as well, are they themselves capable of meeting all the needs that you have end to end? Because you've seen them do really well on certain fronts. And the short answer is no. That's because ChatGPT has been trained on a data set which has been more about content generation, the way AI evolved. And now they're built in these capabilities where ChatGPT can go and look at the answer that it produced and analyze that again as an input. So that's one smaller capability that it has. ChatGPT also has the ability of picking out. So if you give it 5 options and you go on and say, hey, which one is really the best option for me? It can pick all the 5, do some sort of calculation, and then come back to you and say, pick option number 3 or pick option number 4 out of the 5, which this is the best one. So that is another capability, and so on and so forth. Certain models are really good at, let's say, writing new code. Certain models are really good at doing pattern mapping. And anyone who's thinking of analytics, which in itself is very complex because a simple piece of analysis could actually involve data cleaning. It could involve stitching together of multiple sources. It could involve identifying patterns. It could involve writing new code. It could involve a bunch of stuff. It could be very complex. None of the models stand alone are good enough. And that's because you don't see any of these models marketing themselves as an LLM for analytics. And that's because LLM for analytics is actually order 2 of the problem. Order 1 is actually what these LLMs are trying to solve. And now a lot of these companies are working on stitching together these capabilities into what might evolve as an LLM for analytics. But essentially, standalone these models, they can't do the same thing. And if you just try, even with, let's say, ChatGPT, you give it an Excel sheet, and there are tons of products like that on the GPT Store or GPT app store, however you want to call it. There's these GPTs that exclusively go and then write code for you and present a graph out of, let's say, an Excel table and something like that. If you really play hard with them, you'd realize that they start failing when you start asking really tough questions. And that's okay. That's still a step forward in my view, because now you have someone who made a GPT out of everything that OpenAI had and then deployed it. And now a lot of basic use cases for people, maybe 30% of the use cases, which are not very complex, you're simply trying to do really low level stuff, can be done. But actually overcoming the problem of context that I talked about, which is an internal employee has context on who is asking the question, what are they really asking for. The second thing is you can account for factors. So maybe you know that, oh, this question is being asked in the month of December. And that means that you need to exclude all the data that is coming in the last quarter, because the question by nature is a quarterly projection question. Or for that matter, if you're trying to, let's say, do analysis with real-time data, let's say you want what happened 1 month back on the internet. And a very simple example of it could be weather data. So if you are a company that has to do something with, let's say, climate and weather, and you're trying to see what happened in the month of May or June in San Francisco, you are, of course, not going to have those things inbuilt into ChatGPT and OpenAI or any models, because these models have limitation. Some of them are getting more and more up to date, but you'd have to bring that data from outside, from a source that is really up to date. You'd have to stitch that data in with whatever context you have in ChatGPT. And you'd have to tell the system to ensure that there's no duplicacy. You'll have to instruct it. And ChatGPT works wonderfully, or Anthropic, and a lot of these models, without naming anyone specifically, they work beautifully when you are having very small asks. So if your ask is not too complicated, you will get very accurate answers. And with data, the last thing you want is to get an answer where you know that 5 of the 1000 steps that you took were incorrect. You have to have every step accurately mapped. Otherwise, the kind of answers you're going to get, they're not going to be up to the mark. Engineering something on top of LLMs actually needs you to account for a lot of factors like accuracy, reliability, compatibility, and also on top, the context, which can sometimes just lead to hallucinations. So these models, if you go on and say, hey, how many users dropped off in the last month, and if you just feed in the raw data to ChatGPT, what's going to happen is very rarely you will see that the system comes back and says, I can't answer that for you. That probably happens 1 in 1,000 times. It will come back with a very wrong, very confident answer. And that's even more dangerous. I would rather not AI than use an incorrect version of like my source of truth being incorrect and make decisions for my business based on that, which is why I think in general, the adoption as far as analytics and AI goes in the industry is slow. And to overcome these hallucinations, what we are internally as well trying at Crunch, and we have been able to a large extent get rid of them, is to have what we call as a reference library. So think of it as all the ways in which we have solved a particular type of problem in the past being stored somewhere. Now, these ways could be a line of code. It could just be a kind of an instruction. It could be clubbing together of multiple data sets. It could be anything. Now, we go in and teach our system to work with LLMs on top of this library. That means when you ask a question and that question, let's say, has never been asked before, the system is going to still scan through the library and say that, so it looks like no one has asked this question before. And then it's going to break this down into smaller parts. Okay, let's break down the question and understand what really is being asked here. Then maybe for part of the question, it will go to an existing LLM and ask it to write a new line of code. It will bring the answer back from there. Now, based on that new line of code, it will run it on the data set. Maybe this is being done by the same LLM, maybe this is being done by our own engine, maybe it's a mix of all of these things. And then when these things are done, you will see that for the same answer, it's not just the library where all the questions that have been asked before are being referenced to, it's also everything else, which is how do I use and in what sequence do I use these existing LLMs to accurately answer these questions. Now, let's say you did hundreds of steps. You wrote a new code, you did some pattern mapping, you were able to compile something, you ran new code, you maybe picked a function from the library because that was exactly what you needed for that small step. So your one big question, which is a business question, has been broken down into smaller things. And under the hood, all of this is happening. Maybe we had to clean the data, maybe we had to stitch the data together. Now, when you're clubbing all of this together, you still need to account for the fact that before you show it to the user, you're ensuring that there is no error. Meaning, we would have to ask the same question to the system in multiple ways. And when the system is actually convinced that yes, this is the same consistent output all the time, it actually starts surfacing it out in the form of numbers or code. Then there comes a layer of, how do I convert this number or code into a graph that an executive can understand? And then do I add 2 bullet points on top of whatever their question was? So when you ask a question like, which is very simple, let's say a question like, hey, how many users signed up? The system doesn't have to do all of this. In that case, all the library and everything that I'm talking about, that's all pretty useless because maybe you have your raw data and there is a button called sign up or get started and these events are being stored. So all the system has to do is look at the count of those events in the table and then maybe run some cleaning on it so that you can remove dummy data or if someone clicked 2 times, 3 times. So it's a relatively simple question. And in that case, the system is directly going to look at your question, write a line of code, or use the function from the library, which is a simple lookup function and like the counting, and just surface it out to you. But if you go and ask a very complex question, hey, which store location should I be shutting down? Now here I have to look at tons of things. I have to first understand what you mean by store. I have to understand what you mean by store location. Then I have to go on and bifurcate into, what is the context? Do I know anything about you from beforehand? If not, I may have to ask some clarifying questions. Then I start doing my own pattern mapping. So store location. And then all the time the system keeps talking to the user. So it's going and saying, hey, to answer this question, I'll have to look at the footfall. And to answer this question, I'll have to also look at all of the stuff which is about your projections. Maybe I also look at user feedback and surveys, whether people have said something about the particular location being unserved. And there are tons of things. Then I have to do some sort of analysis. There are are these projections. So all of these are the good part about everything in general in the industry is that you're seeing a lot of emerging libraries. There are like AutoML models that are popping up. An AutoML model, for example, could be just think of it as like complex ML capabilities that let people build on top. And if you're using one of these functions from one of these widely reputed libraries, you are likely to be able to build ML capabilities sooner. And there are tons of these new models. So in bits and pieces, people are working on building blocks, but how you really stitched all of it together is what's critical. And that's how I would think of solving anything which is as complex as analytics using large language model. Would I use ChatGPT directly for answering my analytics? You could, but chances are you would run into really bad answers. But then there are GPTs that exist. Yes, they do. And if you really ask tough questions, you will realize that they fail more than often. And how do you really take care of hallucinations? You need to have a library of functions. You need to have some safety checks in place so that before the system actually gives you the answer, it is doing enough by asking the same question in 10 different ways and then ensuring that and any time the system actually sees that there is a difference in answer, it is just going to stop there, ask you back a qualifying question or a clarifying question, and then again do the same job. So you see one answer, you ask one question. Under the hood, maybe there are thousands of questions and answers that are happening, and there are like lots of layers involved, but it all gets a little technical. And for the end executive, they should think of it exactly as the kind of job that a data team would do. So when they ask the data person in their office, hey, go do this for me, and then the data person comes back with a presentation, they did 1,000 things in between. And that is what the AI also needs to do to ensure that the answer is accurate. So that is how our system, at least at Crunch, works. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a way to get in a room with everyone who has learned these things over the years and get to hear all that they have learned in a very informal setup? Maybe somebody could organize a dinner or something like that for it. What do you know? I am doing exactly that. So click on the link below. It will take you to a very small form, fill up your details, and we'll get in touch. I hope to see you there.